Mike. I'm Vice President of the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Commemorating 1919 this year, and you're going to hear more about that from Jacqui. Keep you on our mailing list and keep you informed and grow the organization that's concerned for our local culture and history. So just want to welcome you, and Jacqui.
Thank you, Steffi. Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for coming. We are so pleased to kick off our 2019 season of programs. There have been a number of people involved in the programming this year. A lot of work, time, and effort has gone into creating just a superb number of programs. And as you can see, our theme this year is 1919. Bridges from History, commemorating 100 years of a number of events that have really shaped us in many, many different ways. If you pick up one of these pamphlets, if you go to the Battle of Homestead Foundation website, if you check out the Facebook page, certainly you'll see that we have a fabulous lineup of programs, certainly a number of films, a number of panel discussions, roundtables, and performances. And so the programs this season, are very, very concentrated on some of those events and situations that unfolded at the start of the 20th century through World War I to that point of 1919. And have an impact 100 years later in 2019. In addition to these programs, of course, we have an event on August 26th, the assassination of mine worker organizer Fanny Sellens, a community commemoration, and that program is a day-long commemoration looking into the events surrounding not just, of course, the death of Fanny Sellens, but a celebration of her life and work and other activities as well. The Climate Lecture this year, sponsored by the United Steelworkers, Organizing Against the Odds, 1919 and Today, with guest speaker Ed Yankovic from the United Mine Workers. That's September 29th, Sunday, September 29th at 2 p.m. In addition, we have an overview for those of you that might be new to the Battle of Homestead Foundation. We're looking always to increase our membership, so we have a nice overview, film, and discussion about the Pump House Gang and what the Battle of Homestead Foundation, all those involved do. And last but not least, our next program, which is actually the day after tomorrow, kind of links us back to that wonderful event that we had commemorating the 100-year anniversary, the anniversary of the 1892 Battle of Homestead, featuring Mark Rylance, that fabulous Shakespearean actor who came to Pittsburgh and graced us with his work and continues to work on the story of Homestead and the Homestead Strike. So the program, Mrs. Shakespeare's Will's First and Last Love, is this Saturday here at the Pump House on Saturday, April 27th. And I believe that's William Shakespeare's birthday as well. So it's amply scheduled for that. Today, for our kickoff program, we have a great panel, and I am so pleased to be part of the discussion featuring our panelists. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Eric Leif Davin. He is the author of Crucible, The New Left, Experience in Office, both from Lexington Books. He is also the author of The Great Strike of 1870, 1932 to 1936. Those books are available to you here tonight. And he's going to speak on the 1919 Still Strike and the Red Scare. And both the ACLU and the FBI came out of the Red Scare, so certainly we have a lot to talk about in that regard. My friend Howard Scott is a native of Pittsburgh, a longtime member of the Battle of Homestead Foundation, and is now the editor of the magazine for our statewide group, the Pennsylvania Labor History Society. Howard is retired from the staff of the United Steelworkers, where he worked on organizing, communications, and then strike and contract campaign support with the Strategic Campaigns Department. He's previously worked with community organizing groups, the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Department, Regional Organizing Program, and he's worked at a variety of factories, steel mills, and other blue-collar jobs, and in other places around the country. And last but not least, at the table is Dr. Charles McCollester. Charlie worked at Union Switch and Signal and became involved in the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, the UE, Local 610, where he served as the chief steward. He helped organize the Tri-State Conference and the impact of steel in the Steel Valley Authority in an effort to save the steel industry in the Pittsburgh region. He was the director of the Pennsylvania Center for the Study of Labor Relations and a professor in the Department of Industrial and Labor Relations at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and a former president of the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Charlie is the author of The Point of Pittsburgh, Production and Struggle at the Forks of Ohio. I have been very, very lucky to get to work with so many individuals like those that are seated here today. My name is Jacqui Cavalier. I'm a professor of history at the Community College of Allegheny County, the Allegheny campus. I've been there for 18 years. I'm also the vice president of the AFT, Local 2067 at CCAC. And I'm very, very honored to be a member of the Battle of Homestead Foundation. I was recently elected to the board of directors and I serve on the program committee. So I'm honored to be here with you all tonight. When we think about this 100-year period between from 2019 to 1919, I thought of many different common threads that are woven through that theme. We think, as these gentlemen are going to speak to tonight, the Great Strike of 1919, and we think of the wave of activity that we experienced in the form of teacher strikes last year. Teacher strikes in West Virginia, in Colorado, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Arizona, and Kentucky. Fair pay for teachers. The struggle continues. When we're looking at the juxtaposition of the steel workers and the mine workers and those laborers of the early 20th century, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and the challenges that our workers face today, particularly those like teachers who are underpaid, who are constantly at threat of losing their benefits day after day, and have other challenges each and every day in the form of trying to educate with limited supplies, educate children who have many, many problems as a result of opioid addiction that has impacted their parents, and limited resources themselves. I thought about 1919, Red Summer 1919. Not the Red Scare, but Red Summer 1919. And Red Summer was a wave of over 100 deaths due to racial disparities and, of course, riots that were occurring throughout cities in the United States. Those riots occurred in Washington, D.C. They occurred in Omaha, Nebraska. They occurred in Chicago. In 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, race riots. Interestingly enough, we have a resurgence of membership in the Ku Klux Klan in 1920. A reactionary movement. I thought about these images comparatively when we think about Charlottesville, Virginia, when we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, and we think about, closer to home, the situation with Antoine Rose, the death of Antoine Rose. I thought about anti-Semitism, and certainly when we look at the consequences of World War I and that period between 1919 and 1939, the 20-year period, and then what tragically, of course, impacted us here in Pittsburgh with the Tree of Life massacre last October. I thought about how we define different ideologies. Socialism, what it meant then, what it means now, what it means politically, democratic socialism. I found this cartoon up in the corner of this slide really, really interesting. As we see, you know, this controversy, seeing this controversial figure in the form of, you know, a young woman, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and, you know, some of the references in that cartoon, free college, free healthcare, open borders, and the list goes on. The great fear of the period, that Uncle Sam might be swallowed by foreigners. The Red Scare, nativism, anti-immigration, and certainly what we have in the form of Immigration Acts 1921 and quotas that severely curtailed immigration in the United States. That, of course, I think about very personally, as my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was an immigrant from Italy in 1913. He came here at the age of 16, and he went to Coal Center, and he worked in the mines initially. And then I think about women, and how 1919 was such a pivotal year. You know, we have some images here of women striking, Madam C.J. Walker, who becomes one of the first successful African-American entrepreneurs in the United States. Mary Harris, Mother Jones, pictured there. I forgot to include our own Nellie Bly. And if you think of Nellie Bly, she's the first woman correspondent in World War I on the Serbian front. She is the first woman to report, coincidentally in 1919, a world heavyweight championship from ringside. That was between Dempsey and Willard. And she's the first woman to have a train named after her. So pretty important in that regard. And then I think of the women's movement that we see in so many different ways today. The Me Too movement, the Women's March, and so on. And with that, I think of 1919 being the pivotal year where women finally get a constitutional amendment that gives them a right to vote, ratified and then accepted by Congress in 1920. When we think about the women's movement in America, and when I teach, I ask about women's suffrage, you know, what is your interpretation, what do you think, what do you know about women's suffrage? And without fail, of course, it's always Susan B. Anthony, that name. And of course, she's very, very important. She, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you know, all of the rest of those women that were so important in pursuing the right to vote for women. Keeping in mind that even though the 14th Amendment gave us our first national definition of citizenship, due process of law, and equal protection under the law, the Supreme Court voted unanimously not to allow women the right to vote in respect to the 14th Amendment and that question of citizenship. So by the end of the 19th century, what women are facing is whether or not the fight for the right to vote will be a state-by-state campaign, or if in fact they will go for the gusto, go for it all, and go for that constitutional amendment. And we see a break, so to speak, in the movement, in the women's suffrage movement, by the latter part of the 19th century, because you have the old guard versus the new guard to a certain extent. The American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. But out of that movement will come a group of younger suffragists, suffragists who have a different take on what is required in order to get that constitutional amendment. And they literally put their lives on the line to see that happen. It's people like Alice Paul. She was a Quaker. She was educated at what is now Columbia University. But she went to England with her counterpart in the left-hand corner, Lucy Burns. And they saw the radicalization of suffrage and the suffragists and the actions that they were willing to undertake, in England in particular, in order to get their voices heard. Ida B. Wells Barnett. Ida B. Wells Barnett was instrumental in leading an anti-lynching campaign in America. Her position was based on the notion that lynching is due largely to the fact that black men in America are potentially becoming, as a result of socioeconomic mobility, were considered much greater threats as a result of competition. And lynching, of course, was a result of that. And so it was really important for her and her counterparts, black women, to be involved in the suffrage movement. And yet, those who were leading the way of the National Women's Party, which broke from the National American Women's Suffrage Association, those who were leading the way had concerns about how the Democratic Party would receive them if, in fact, they allowed black women into their ranks. And so you have racial inequality in a movement that, of course, is after equality. Okay? I mentioned Alice Paul and Lucy Burns went to England, and they were very, very familiar with the techniques that were being undertaken in England. In fact, some of the old guard suffragists like Carrie Chapman Catt and others, feared the fact that they were radicals. We don't want brick throwers, women who were willing to necessarily engage in violence if necessary in our ranks. It will give us a bad name. They were also concerned about how Woodrow Wilson, of course, elected to the presidency as a Democrat, a Southern Democrat. Remember, Wilson may have been a professor of political science at Princeton, but he was from Virginia. So a Southern Democrat would receive them. We think of the juxtaposition of the old guard suffragists, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as compared to the new guard, the National Women's Party, Inez Milholland, the woman on the horse. And they lead a parade in Washington, D.C. on the day of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in March of 1913. That parade turned violent, and of course, there was a great opposition and reaction to those women who were fighting for their right to vote. Ida B. Wells Barnett was initially asked to march at the back of that parade towards the end. She and her counterparts proudly stepped in towards the front of the line and made their positions known. What was so interesting is the Sentinels, those women who were protesting in front of the White House, were doing so once Wilson was elected to the presidency. The question became in 1914, 15, 16, would this activity continue as World War I unfolded? And certainly that question was paramount in 1917. Because they were protesting a wartime president. And those women continue to do so. If you look at the banners here, I just find them so interesting. I know they're a little bit blurry because I couldn't get a good image of them. But if you look at the one on the left, Kaiser Wilson, that is really, really taking that head on. Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your eye. To the envoys of Russia, President Wilson and Envoy Root are deceiving Russia. They say we are a democracy. Help us win a world war so that democracies may survive. We, the women of America, tell you America is not a democracy. 20 million women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of national enfranchisement. Help us make this nation really free. Tell our government that it must liberate its people before it can claim free Russia as an ally. These women were imprisoned because of their activities. It was very, very difficult to find a charge because they were protesting the president in front of the White House, which is public property. So they got him on obstruction of traffic. And the offer was pay $10, a fine, or go to Occoquan workhouse in Virginia for 60 days. And one by one, these women chose prison. Because by paying the fine, they would have admitted wrongdoing, and they were doing nothing wrong. So it's very, very interesting. Alice Paul, of course, is the holdout because they fear she is the leader, and they don't, the other suffragists, of course, members of the National Women's Party, they don't want her to go to prison because she needs to continue to fight and lead the way. But Alice understands that she can probably do more good from inside prison than outside. And so she deliberately protests. And of course, they take her to prison. So it's important, this is very, very important at this time, 1917, because the media is, painting Alice Paul very, very effectively as a political prisoner. And the concern is that the international media will get a hold of this, okay? And Alice Paul goes on a hunger strike, and other suffragists inside the workhouse follow her. And it's very, very difficult to control this activity. And once Wilson's administration gets word of this, they of course send in a psychologist to evaluate Alice Paul because they want to deem her insane, because then they can put her in an asylum. And that psychologist's report is very, very important because he has one line that stays with us to this day. That is his evaluation. We see it on bumper stickers, we see it on, that is the psychologist's evaluation of Alice Paul. Courage in women is often mistaken for insanity, and he would not declare her insane. She was very deliberate in the way in which she answered her questions. Ultimately, those 217 women who were imprisoned are pardoned under the Harding administration. 1919, ratification occurs. Tennessee is the last state to ratify. In 1920, the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, is written into law. Alice Paul does not stop there, however. What does she do next? Does anyone know? Alice Paul is the author of the Equal Rights Amendment. She authors the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. Very simple. Equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Interestingly enough, this is a headline from the New York Times in February 2019. What is the Equal Rights Amendment and why are we talking about it now? So there's, of course, a new debate, a new conversation concerning ratification of the ERA. it fell three states short of ratification and has been presented in every session of Congress since the original presentation in 1923. Okay? So everything old is new again. When we revisit time and time again issues like equality, equal rights, civil rights, immigration, certainly our politics of the moment, and so many other issues that we face today in 2019. It's important to understand those who came before us. And when I teach the history of women at CCAC, and we discuss a number of topics, we do truly sit on the shoulders of giants.
The steel strike of 1919 it did not happen in isolation. And so tonight I would like to talk about the larger political context within which the 1919 steel strike took place. 1919 was a year of great hope and great fear for millions of Americans. The horrors of the Great War, as World War I was then known, ended on November 11th, 1918. And the year that followed, 1919, witnessed in Europe a wave of hope and fear, hope for a workers' utopia, and also fear of a new tyranny arising out of that workers' utopia. In America, 1919 also brought a year of hope and fear, the hope of a new era of working class empowerment, and the fear that such working class empowerment threatened the very fabric of American society. There was a widespread fear of foreign-born terrorists pledging allegiance to a foreign ideology that was inimical to not only America, but American values. Central to those hopes and those fears was, of course, the Great Steel Strike of 1919. It was the largest strike in American history up until that time. At its height, about 250,000 or more steel workers, mostly of immigrant background, were on strike nationwide. And for those workers, it promised to bring about the long-sought unionization of the most basic industry of America's industrial economy. In doing so, they hoped that it would also finally fulfill for them the promise of America. For those who opposed them, the strike not only threatened the very nature of the American economic model, but also America itself. And thus, for both sides, it was a battle over more than just economics. It was a battle over the very meaning of America and what it stood for and what it meant to be an American. And understanding what encouraged both the hopes of the workers and the fears of those who resisted and ultimately defeated them helps us comprehend why the 1919 steel strike erupted when it did, why the workers fought for the strike so tenaciously, and why the authorities resisted it with such fear and such great ferocity. So let us step back. The end of the Great War brought about the destruction of four great and powerful empires: the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, and the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. And in the wake of their destruction, a wave of utopian ferment swept across Europe. A war that many viewed as an imperialist war morphed into an international class war that seemed somehow, in some way, connected to events in Russia. The first of these great empires to collapse, even before the war ended, was the Romanov in Russia. At the end of 1917, a revolutionary, class-conscious Bolshevik government replaced it. And that revolutionary government was beset on all sides by forces that threatened to destroy it. Throughout the whole of 1919, the Bolshevik government battled military intervention from the Allied powers of France, Britain, and the United States. And at the same time, the Bolsheviks fought a vicious civil war against counter-revolutionary armies seeking to destroy them and restore the monarchy. At the end of 1919, the Bolshevik government remained stronger than ever. The next empire to fall was the Hohenzollern in Germany, and it too collapsed before the war ended. In fact, its very collapse ended the war. And in its wake, a wave of mutiny and rebellion swept quickly across Germany. A separatist Bavarian Soviet Republic based in Munich was declared. A caretaker government led by the Social Democratic Party took over in Berlin as far-left radicals formed a German communist party in emulation of the Russian Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, and the long-lived House of Habsburg ceased to exist. The empire splintered into a balkanized collection of successor states. The Austrian Social Democrats took over in Vienna, and a Soviet republic seeking an alliance with Russian Bolsheviks took power in Hungary. By the end of 1918, revolution was on the march everywhere in Central Europe, as were minor civil wars. Of them all, however, events in Germany concerned Europeans the most. In January of 1919, a communist revolt erupted in Berlin. The Social Democratic government moved many of its administrative functions to the city of Weimar, thus giving us the Weimar Republic, and called upon the army to attack the rebels. The army did so in a half-hearted way. The government therefore called upon the Freikorps to suppress the uprising. The Freikorps were paramilitary groups of well-armed, well-disciplined veterans of the former Imperial Army that refused to disband after the armistice, led by people like Captain Erwin Rommel, later of Afrika Korps fame. The Freikorps suppressed the uprising in Berlin, killed two of its leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. On May 1st, the Freikorps fought its way into Munich and seized control of that city, ending the Bavarian Soviet Republic. The Hungarian Soviet Republic lasted a little while longer. Well, that was what was happening in Germany. Events in the Allied nations were just as disturbing to everybody. On January 26th, a labor uprising in Belfast resulted in 26 labor unions in Belfast, Ireland, declaring a general strike, shutting down the entire city. The very next day, a general strike shut down the city of Glasgow, Scotland. There were similar strikes in other nations. There were anarchist, separatist uprisings in Spain. There was a mutiny in the French Black Sea Fleet, which was supporting the military intervention of Crimea and Ukraine. There was much to worry about. And all of these events were giving primary newspaper coverage in the American newspapers. To them, it seemed that Bolshevism was on the march everywhere, and their panic was heightened by a wave of strikes in America throughout 1919, of which the steel strike was just one. Over the course of the year 1919, more than 4 million American workers, 20% of the workforce, walked out in over 3,600 strikes in the year 1919. Further, the number of strikes increased from month to month to month throughout the year. And as the strike wave grew, so did the hysteria of the authorities. To the American authorities, it seemed that the Russian Bolsheviks were the inspiration, if not the instigators, of this huge strike wave that was convulsing America at this time. And indeed, the Russian Revolution and the subsequent post-war turmoil in Europe did inspire American industrial workers. Despite the fears of the authorities, however, this was not because the workers necessarily shared the ideology of the Russian revolutionaries. Rather, it was because there had been a revolution at all. Russia and Eastern Europe were the homelands of vast numbers of the immigrant industrial workers of America. Wealthy nobles and tyrannical czars had ruled their ancestral homelands for centuries. Change had seemed to be impossible. But now, back home, the czar had been deposed. The old nobility had been overthrown. And if that could happen back in their homelands, it inspired them with the hope that tyrannical corporate czars could be overthrown in the new homeland, in America. However, this would not be done through armed insurrection. It would be done through their industrial unions and the idea of new unionism, which many of these unions espoused. New unionism was the concept that gave millions of American industrial workers the hope that motivated them to fight fiercely in 1919. So let's find out a little bit about new unionism. It wasn't a precise ideology by any means. Rather, it was a general term for the new style of union organizing in the mass production industries that was taking root at the time. It included the belief in increased militancy, of aggressively fighting back against the adverse conditions that had been brought on by the second industrial revolution that had reshaped the American economy since the 1890s. It also preached the idea of industrial unionism, of unionism across an entire industry, regardless of the particular job within that industry. This was in direct opposition to the old craft unionism of the American Federation of Labor, the FFL. One reason for the advocacy of industrial unionism was practical reality. You had to have an army to fight an army. That simple. The old, specialized, separate AFL craft unions made it easy for the giant and monolithic corporations to divide and conquer the workers. But the new unionism also preached industrial unionism not just for practical reasons, but for ideological reasons. It argued that all workers, perhaps all workers in the world, should belong eventually to one big union. And once that happened, real change could come. And that real change was the long-term vision of the new unionism. The industrial unions and organizations espousing the new unionism not only viewed themselves as fighting unions, but also as educational unions. They therefore tied mundane union activities to the long-term goal of either anti-capitalist revolution, as in the case of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, or at the very least, extensive radical reform, as in the case of most such unions. Thus, these new unions saw themselves as more than just workplace bargaining agents, as the old pure and simple unions of the AFL did. They also saw themselves as educational and political organizations working to change society as a whole, the sole hope, they thought, of a better world. Thus, at the same time that events in Russia, events in Europe sent shivers down the spines of the American authorities, it also gave hope to these workers who believed in the new unionism that a new age of freedom was dawning for them in 1919. And so the militant strikes proclaiming the ideas of the new unionism proliferated across the country in 1919, spreading both hope and, of course, fear across the land. As the year began, 1919, the first major one of these was in Lawrence, Massachusetts. That city was the scene of the dramatic IWW-led textile strike of 1912, the so-called Bread and Roses strike. That strike had ended in victory for the workers and spread the fame of the IWW as a fighting industrial union with a radical vision for a better America. Well, in 1919, the Lawrence textile workers still worked 9-hour days. They still worked 6 days a week. So on February 9th, they launched a strike of all textile workers in Lawrence for an 8-hour day with no reduction in pay. And once more, they invited the IWW to come in and help them. Now, the federal government had almost crippled the IWW the previous summer with a mass trial that had sentenced Big Bill Haywood and 100 other top IWW leaders to long prison terms for their opposition to the Great War. However, Carlo Tresca and Arturo Giovannitti, two of the leaders of the 1912 strike, had avoided prison. They returned to Lawrence in 1919 to again help lead the strike, which dragged on for months and months and months throughout 1919. 3 days after the Lawrence strike began, a general strike erupted in Seattle, Washington on February 6th. Now, earlier in Seattle, over 35,000 shipyard workers in that West Coast city had walked out, demanding shorter hours and higher wages. Now, the Seattle Central Labor Council, representing all unions in the city, called out every worker in Seattle, regardless of occupation, to support them. The Central Labor Council felt that it had to respond in this fashion in order to, quote, promote labor solidarity against the growing militancy of employers, unquote. 60,000 workers representing almost every trade answered the call and shut down the city of Seattle, Washington. Seattle newspapers, of course, reacted hysterically, linking the general strike to events overseas. "This is America, not Russia," cried the Star. The Post-Intelligencer in Seattle ran a front-page cartoon showing a red flag flying above the stars and stripes. Headlines in other newspapers across the country roared, "Reds directing Seattle strike to test chance for revolution in America." In Seattle, declared the Cleveland Plain Dealer, quote, "the Bolshevik beast had come into the open at last," unquote. It was only a middling step from Petrograd to Seattle, warned the Chicago Tribune. This was the beginning of the infamous Red Scare that seized the authorities and millions of Americans over the course of the year 1919. Seattle Mayor Ole Hansen declared that the general strike was part of an IWW plot to launch a revolutionary holocaust in America. The strikers, who comprised virtually every worker in the city of Seattle, were deep red revolutionaries, he said, who, quote, want to take possession of our American government and try to duplicate the anarchy of Russia, unquote. He called for the United States Army troops at a nearby base to take control of the city of Seattle. And on February 6th, in a car draped in the stars and stripes, he led their entrance into Seattle. He called upon the Central Labor Council to end the strike or see it crushed by military force. On February 10th, the council called off the Seattle general strike. Even so, U.S. Secretary of Labor, William B. Wilson, warned that, quote, the recent strikes in Lawrence and Seattle and other places were not industrial economic disputes in their origin, but were the results of a deliberate, organized attempt at a social and political movement to establish social Soviet governments the United States, unquote. U.S. Secretary of War Newton Baker agreed, saying, quote, "Since the armistice, there has been a growing agitation and unrest evidenced by widespread industrial controversies. Our newspapers are filled with accounts of violent agitation by so-called Bolsheviks and radicals courting violence and urging action in behalf of what they call revolution," unquote. These cabinet secretaries were part of a rising chorus of voices in the spring of 1919, warning of the Red Menace to America. The hidden hand of Bolshevism was at work everywhere in America, behind every labor disturbance. A dangerous manifestation of that Red Menace was a series of Mayday bombs that were mailed to numerous prominent men at the end of April 1919. On April 28th, a bomb was detected in the mail of Seattle Mayor Ole Hansen before it exploded. Another bomb was sent to Georgia's ex-Senator Thomas Hardwick, which blew off both hands of his black maid as she opened it. Thus alerted to the danger, on April 30th, the U.S. Postal Service discovered another 34 bombs that had been mailed to government individuals who included U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, Secretary of Labor William Wilson, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Chairman of the U.S. Senate Bolshevik Investigating Committee, Postmaster General Albert Burleson, who had banned radical literature from the mails, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who had overseen and presided over the big IWW trial that had sentenced Big Bill Haywood and the other top IWW leaders to prison. Bombs also to Frederick C. Howe, who was Ellis Island's Commissioner of Immigration, and bombs to John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. Newspapers screamed, "Reds plan big Mayday murder spree," and criminal anarchy laws blossomed across the land in the resulting national hysteria. Then the Winnipeg General Strike erupted in Canada on May 15th. Its origin was a strike by the city's metal trades unions demanding, again, shorter hours, higher wages. In solidarity, the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council called for a general strike which shut down the entire city of Winnipeg. Almost all the workers in the city, including the police, including the firemen, including all other municipal workers, answered the call and went out on strike. Despite the purely economic origin, it was seen as yet another Bolshevik forerunner. Newspapers in the United States gave it the full Red Scare treatment. They reported many horror stories, none of which were true. And on June 2nd, simply to show solidarity with the Winnipeg General Strike, yet another general strike erupted in Canada, this time in Vancouver, shutting down the entire city of Vancouver. Meanwhile, on the very same day as the Vancouver General Strike, a second wave of bombs exploded in 8 American cities. The most prominent target was, yet again, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. The powerful bomb at his Washington, D.C. home exploded just as he was going to bed. It blew off the entire front of his house, although he was not injured. It also damaged the home of Assistant Secretary of Navy Franklin D. Roosevelt, who lived right across the street, jolting him awake. A manifesto found near each of the explosions in each of the cities read, in part, quote, "There will have to be bloodshed. We will destroy and rid the world of your tyrannical institutions. Long live the social revolution," unquote. And it was signed by the anarchist fighters. So in response, Attorney General Palmer proposed more stringent anti-radical laws. He expanded the Red Scare by launching an all-out manhunt for the bombers who had bombed his house and all other subversives who threatened America. It was to be organized and led by a special anti-radical division under the direction of a young 24-year-old man named J. Edgar Hoover. This was the origin of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, which Hoover was to lead for decades thereafter. But the number of strikes across the nation still increased. In April, there were 248 strikes. In June, there were 303 strikes. In July, there were 360 strikes. There are many, many, many more. One could go on. Then a yet more worrisome menace appeared. At its June convention in Atlantic City, the American Federation of Labor declared that it was prepared to grant charters to police unions. By August, the police forces in 37 large cities had been accepted into the FFL. The police in Boston also unanimously expressed interest in organizing and joining the FFL. The police commissioner and the mayor of Boston adamantly opposed that possibility. After months of fruitless negotiations, the entire Boston police force walked off the job on September 16th. There were no police in Boston. There was no alternative police force to take their place. Riots, looting broke out, resulting in hundreds of thousands of dollars of lost and damaged property. Boston seemed to have become the American Petrograd. Quote, "Lenin and Trotsky are on their way," warned the Wall Street Journal in a headline. Bolshevism in the United States, no longer a specter, declared the Philadelphia Public Ledger. Boston in chaos reveals its sinister substance. In response to the Boston police strike, a little-known Republican Massachusetts governor named Calvin Coolidge telegrammed AFL chief Samuel Gompers saying, quote, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, at any time," unquote. Declaring that there would be no negotiations, he also permanently fired the entire Boston police force. Never again did any one of them ever work as a policeman in Boston. He next sent in the state's National Guard to establish military rule in the city of Boston. Soon thereafter, Coolidge signed legislation quickly passed by the state legislature establishing the Massachusetts State Police. His tough response to the crisis resulted in his overwhelming re-election as governor of Massachusetts in the November 1919 election. The next year, his new fame carried him into the vice presidency, and soon thereafter, it carried him into the White House as the 30th President of the United States of America. So it was in this atmosphere of hope and hysteria that 250,000 steelworkers, soon to be 350,000 steelworkers, launched a nationwide steel strike on September 22nd to gain the right to unionize. It was to last for over 3 months, well into the next year, 1920. And the fact that William Z. Foster, a former IWW organizer, led the 1919 steel strike, only added to the hysteria of the authorities. 8 years earlier, before this, when he was still in the IWW, Foster had authored a fact that nearly 70% of the striking steel workers were of immigrant background, also made it easier to label the strikers as un-American hunkies and thus suspect in their loyalty. The foreign element, charged the New York Times, is steeped in the doctrines of class war. The authorities, of course, unleashed fearful repression against the workers. Armed guards surrounded the steel mills of the Steel Valley and everywhere else. Thousands of special deputies patrolled the mill towns. Picket lines were brutally dispersed. Free speech became a crime. Club-swinging state policemen rode their horses onto the sidewalks and into the businesses and even into the company houses. Meanwhile, as the steel strike dragged on, other battles were being fought. On November 1st, as the steel strike expanded, the United Mine Workers led out 400,000 mine workers in a nationwide strike. and that strike would last until December 10th. On November 7th, the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched perhaps the most well-remembered aspect of the Red Scare, the notorious Palmer raids against suspected radicals. He raided labor and leftist organizations in 18 cities. On November 15th, Palmer's men raided and wrecked the IWW headquarters in New York City. In Kansas City, 27 IWW members were sentenced to a total of 123 years in prison on charges of conspiracy against the United States government. On December 21st, Palmer packed 250 Russian radicals onto a dilapidated transport ship and deported them to Russia without benefit of a trial. The vast majority of these deportees were simply common working men who happened to belong to the Union of Russian Workers. However, two of the passengers were the notorious anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. Neither would ever again set foot in the United States of America. On January 2nd, more of Palmer's raids in 23 cities seized 4,000 suspected radicals. In Boston, 800 of them were marched in chains down to the dockside for shipping to prison on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. In Detroit, another 800 suspected radicals were held incommunicado in a derelict building and denied the right to counsel. And in Lynn, Massachusetts, 39 men were arrested at a meeting where they were discussing the establishment of a co-op bakery. Altogether that month, the Palmer raids scooped up 10,000 people in 70 cities, with members of the IWW, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and the International Ladies Garment Workers Unions coming in for particular attention. It was in response to these raids that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was born. Finally, on January 8th, 1920, the Red Scare still raging on, the Great Steel Strike ended. The workers' efforts to unionize the steel industry was broken, and the workers struggled back to work. The year 1919 had been one of great hopes for millions in America and great fear for millions of others. In the coming decade of the 1920s, there would come in an era of both Republican ascendancy and labor repression. In the 1930s, however, Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose home had been damaged in the anarchist bomb wave of 1919, offered America a New Deal. And that New Deal finally brought the long-sought unionization of America's industrial economy, for which the steel strikers had fought in 1919. However, the battle over the meaning of America and what it meant to an American continued, and has continued to this very day.
Pittsburgh, up until this time, was the largest steel center. Chicago was quickly taking over as the primary steel center in the United States. But these were smoky old industries. Here's Duquesne, Norm. There's Duquesne. The other one, I believe, was Braddock. Braddock had union representation since the Knights of Labor of the 1870s and 80s, but union organizing frequently revolves around how much union density there is in an industry. So despite the best intentions at single locations to improve conditions for workers, it really requires that you have density within the whole industry. And this 1919 effort was a genuine effort to take the steel industry across the United States and to organize. Here's another Pittsburgh shot from the era. I put this picture in here. We could have a whole program itself on what was going on the racial front in the United States at the time, but hundreds of thousands of African Americans and millions of whites had joined the army or had been drafted into the army prior to this. one of the popular songs right in the aftermath of the war was, how are we going to keep them down on the farm once that they've seen Paris? You know, they were really concerned that people were not going to fit back into their social whole, you know, designated position there, which they didn't, you know, thankfully. And that goes for African Americans, that goes for ordinary working folks in the United States. This was just a little cartoon of the period where the worker coming up to the boss and making a request. Very simple answer, no. Well, this is a picture of the Seattle general strike that Eric was talking about. This was their soup kitchen where they were feeding the people coming in at the end of the day and getting boxes of food and donations. This is Winnipeg, Canada, where, as Eric had mentioned, there was a general strike, mass general strike, stirred up a lot of concern in the press. We've got a few pictures here of the local you know, industrial scene, some of the equipment they were using and materials that they were making. They were coming off of this big period where they were making war munitions, and actually, though much less discussed, women had been introduced into factories across the United States to fill in for the manpower loss due to the war and the draft. Yeah, here's a picture of some of the women who had been working through 1917, 1918, and into the beginning of 1919, before most of them in heavy industry lost their jobs to men returning. This is just a factory picture from the era of the kind of folks that were around here. And just a reminder, you know, it was frequently called the Hunky Strike, the 1919 steel strike, based on Hungarians, which was frequently used to include anybody from Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe. But Hungary had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, you know, up until the end of World War II, World War I. So, you know, it was a pejorative, really, during that period to be called a Hungarian. And as I say, the strike became known to many as the Hunky Strike. I put this picture here that, you know, many of the African American workers, the mine workers were an exception and some others, but they had these, due to the laws of the time, the segregation laws, black workers would sometimes find themselves organizing black unions within, you know, larger workplaces. So there were hundreds of African American unions at the time. I know when I worked with the Paper Workers Union, there had been previous African American locals within a steel mill that would have a white local as well. So this was part of the response to you know, the laws of the time and how to work around them. Here's just a little summary of the steel production in metric tons through the 20th century up to the current times. And as you'll see, there was a huge drop-off in the 30s, but there was also a giant drop-off there in the 1920s, 1920 era. So it ended up not being, you know, of course the time to strike is when there's a great need for the products that are being produced. And unfortunately for the strikers, the needs were dying down as the war had ended. And there were a number of factors, it was one of the factors that was working against them there. It was a coalition of unions rather than a single, you know, primary union, as with the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, to organize industrial within the factories. This was the primary union, of course, the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers at that point. The tin workers had joined in 1899. But there was a huge number of International Association of Machinists, the plumbers, the carpenters, all these other unions were part of a coalition that determined to go at the organized steel. They were confronting these coal and iron police who were really employees of, you know, the coal companies, the steel companies, the railroads. There were dozens of them. Well, more than dozens of them. Big steel strike starts. Okay, Chicago. It was late in the year. It was kind of unfortunate. Usually strikes to begin when the weather's starting to go foul. That's not a great time to kick them off. As Eric had mentioned, there was quite an effort to make the steel strike out to be something that it wasn't. And you can see through a series of, well, we have some other cartoons there as well, depicting the strikers as being, you know, Bolshevik radicals. Now this was something that was kind of interesting. The president of the Pennsylvania Federation of Labor, Scotty Maurer, out of Reading, PA, and he had these posters made up of repression during the strike. The police, you know, sweeping people off of the streets, mass arrests, but you know, it being in the immediate post-World War I period, call it the Prussianizing of Pennsylvania in this poster. Okay, so this is William Z. Foster here in the middle, who was designated as the primary organizer for the 1919 steel effort. I might mention there had been the previous year a successful effort to organize the packing house workers in Chicago. Foster had been the key organizer on that one as well. And it was under the War Labor Board that had been set up during World War I and had been successful. They got union contracts at Armour and all these major meatpacking companies in 1917, 1918 as a result of their strikes. So they had a precedent here where they had been successful. Unfortunately, that labor board mechanism had been shut down once World War I ended, and they're kind of walking into a different era here. This is Judge Gary, who was the head of the U.S. Steel Corporation at the time, and he was the #1 problem there. They could not get him to negotiate. He was called before Congress, as was Foster, mainly to explain that book, Syndicalism, that he had written about. But they really never put any huge pressure on Geary to do right by the strikers. Okay, this is a multilingual ballot as to whether to call the strike or not, and a majority voted for it. But I guess we wanted to point this out as being really the high watermark of efforts to divide the workforce by way of nationality, ethnicity, race. It was extensive that they were really trying to break solidarity, I guess would be the best way to put it. Fanny Sellens had died right prior to the steel strike being called. She, as mentioned, she was out of St. Louis, or she was born in New Orleans, raised in St. Louis, had been a very effective organizer for the ladies' garment workers, and attracted the attention of the United Mine Workers. Mother Jones considered her a protege, and Here she got killed by company guards up outside of Brackenridge at Ducktown, PA. And it was kind of a rallying cry for the steel strikers during that period. Charlie's book has some great passages about Fanny Sellens and her life. Now here's this beautiful painting that Jennifer Rumpel's just completed of Fanny Sellens, and she was in a Fairmont, West Virginia jail for union activity a few years before she died. And so Jennifer did a lovely picture here. I have it out here one of these times. Okay. A steel rally. I believe Chicago. Okay, now they had activated these National Guard units, as well as the state police, the private police, and made a big effort to get replacement workers into these struck steel mills across the board. This is just it's kind of a fuzzy picture, but it's a big steel workers mass meeting on the eve of the strike in Chicago. This also is from Chicago, but you know, all these young workers with their little strike handbill. This is Farrell, Pennsylvania. The state police being used, shotguns, everything else to break up picket lines. You know, they would not allow mass beatings. They were raiding the union halls because they were doing everything they could to break up this strike. Okay, here's some more of these cartoons about European radicals being behind all this labor unrest. Implying that it was some sort of German, well, both sides were calling each other Kaisers and the rest, but they made pretty good use of it. And this is some kind of cartoon about discarding, getting rid of the radicals. This is actually a picture of them preparing to be deported aboard the Buford, USS Buford, the radicals that have been rounded up during the Palmer raids. Here they are, some of them boarding the Buford. I believe, Charlie, you might know better, but I believe this was like Braddock.
It's always described as either Braddock or Homestead.
They were whooping up on them. By the way, that Homestead really, they cracked down on this area. They totally wiped out one of these fraternal groups, the Union of Russian Workers, it was called, that had been active in Homestead, and as well as all the way down into West Virginia, they've been active. This is the smashed up IWW headquarters in Chicago, where they, you know, not only did they raid it for the people, but they were smashing up all their equipment and getting rid of all their papers as well. The Pittsburgh IWW was thoroughly infiltrated with spies who had really done a number on the local organization that had been active in both the McKees Rocks press steel car strike of 1909 and on through with the cigar workers, female cigar workers, mainly in the Hill District area. And of course, we had that one write-up that indicated that Joe Hill, the labor troubadour, came to Pittsburgh to sing his songs for the cigar workers that were on strike. This is Chicago. I believe that's a guy named Charles Rutenberg, who became, well, he was one of the heads of the Workers' Party in the 20s before he died. Okay, well, I kind of wrap it up because I think it's important to remember there were lessons learned here. A lot of the people who had been, you know, working 20 years in the industry at the time of the CIO's success in organizing steel were, they earned their chops during the 1919 strike and knew what to expect. And this was a strike captain from the packing house workers during the CIO union drive. And here's another picture of the CIO finally succeeding in organizing the steel industry by 1939, 1940. By 1942, the little steel companies who had held out so long, they finally signed union contracts as well. Okay, thank you.
And I think 1919 lays out those issues at very stark. So be 100% American. Go back to work. Go back to work. Why are you stopping work? What are the motives of the men who ask you to quit? Do they love you? Do they love America and the American ideals of government? Or do they seek power for themselves and trouble for America? Go back to work. Stick to the job. And thank God that America is still the land of the free. 300,000 went on strike in the Pittsburgh area. I'm not exactly sure what the number is, but it is estimated that, according to newspaper reports, if you added them up, 300,000 went on strike, but 4 million went back to work. The opening accounts in the newspaper talk about hardly anybody's on strike, but then a week later they're talking about 10,000 return in the Mon Valley. And the contradictions are just absolutely extreme in terms of the press is all over the place. And Uniform when she was arrested and held in jail, and they offered her that she could get out after, I think she was in there a month or so. There was a huge campaign to get her out. Mine workers all over the country wrote letters to the president. There was great pressure to let her go, but they wanted her to promise never come back to Collier, West Virginia. And this deserves to be carved in stone, I think, up in Tarentum, or up in Ducktown, where she was killed. I am free. She refuses, and she stays in jail for another month or two. I am free, and I have a right to walk or talk any place in this country as long as I obey the law. I've done nothing wrong. The only wrong they can say I've done is to take shoes to the little children in Colliers who needed them. And when I think of their bare little feet, blue with the cruel blasts of winter, it makes me determined that if it be wrong to put shoes upon those little feet, then I will continue to do wrong so long as I have hands and feet to crawl to Colliers. So that's an affirmation of a certain Americanism. And the other, I want to read the quote from Mother Jones about the strike. She said, Mother always had a way of putting things very succinctly. During the war, the working people were made to believe that they amounted to something. Up and down the land, the workers heard the word democracy. They were asked to work for it, to give their wages to it, to give their lives for it. They were told that their labor, their money, their flesh were bulwarks against tyranny, and that and autocracy. So believing, the steelworkers, 300,000 of them rose en masse against Kaiser Gary, the president of the American Steel Corporation. The slaves asked their czar for the abolition of the 12-hour day, for a crumb from the huge loaf of profits made in the Great War, and for the right to organize. Czar Gary met his workers, as is the customary way with tyrants. He could not shoot them down as did the Tsar Nicholas when petitioned by his peasants, but he ordered forth his two faithful generals, Fear and Starvation, one to clutch at the worker's throat, the other at his stomach and the stomachs of his children. So much of what 1919 was about was ethnic prejudice, anti-immigrant feelings stirring up. These immigrants who had created much of the steel industry, were the main labor force, were now turned upon as the major enemy. And the other thing is, of course, is racism. And I wanted to read just 2 quotes from that and call it and open up for discussion. But the African Americans situation, and actually William Z. Foster is about the only one who gives a coherent explanation of the forces that were in his book on the 1919 strike, and sympathetic to what the Negro worker was facing and why they were the prime strikebreakers. First of all, economic necessity, the collapse of the cotton crop because of the boll weevil infestation in 1916 and afterward. Opportunity. The corporations were going through the South with empty boxcars, inviting people to come up and make an amazing amount of money for people who had very little experience even with the money economy, who were indentured servants at best. But also their own leadership, the ministers and the religious people who were greatly respected were hostile to the unions, because unions, many of them, not the United Mine Workers. The United Mine Workers in its constitution in 1890 says no discrimination on the basis of race. But most unions did have discrimination, certainly many of the craft unions that were part of the 1919 struggle. So there was the use of black strikebreakers. I used to always say, folks talking in Braddock and other places, that so much of the roots of the conflict between the Slavic folks and the African American peoples is rooted in 1919, and 3 generations, 4 generations later, people don't remember why, but they know that that hostility is deeply embedded in their people, their traditions. What's interesting to me, when I went back over, I read an awful lot, I went back through the interfaith church documents and stuff, because I actually went to Rockefeller Center, tried to track down, there was a 3rd volume supposedly had been completed on the use of black strikebreakers. But when you go through the first 2 volumes, the only ones that appeared in print, there's hardly a mention of them. There was hardly a mention of them at all. They were like, they keep talking about the steelworkers returning as if it's all the hunkies giving up and coming back to work. But many of these were the black strikebreakers being brought in, but there wasn't any bragging by the Republicans or by the powers that be that our good old black folks that we helped in the Civil War have now come north to help us out. There was none of that. They never mentioned who these folks were that were being imported into Duquesne and Braddock and used as a club against the Slavic workers. And of course, these were citizens. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Civil War had given citizenship to black Americans. And so for the moment, I just wanted to read the quote by William Attaway, who wrote a really very, very interesting novel called Blood on the Forge about Duquesne during the 1919 steel strike. He wrote from a very left-wing view, very sympathetic to the plight of the African Americans. The union organizers made desperate efforts to induce the black men to join the movement toward the strike, but the steel interests had bought the black leaders. A victory for the mill owners, they said, would be a victory for the Negro worker. The black worker had never advanced through unions. He advanced fighting alongside the owners. Attaway described the newfound feeling of power that came with being deputized, and they used particularly in Duquesne and generally in Mon Valley, black deputies were sworn in. Foster estimated 25,000 armed men that the Steel Corporation controlled in the Mon Valley during the 1919 strike. The more official number was over 10,000, which were virtually all your managerial people in the mills and your professional class in the towns signed up in huge numbers. But there also were black deputies sent in to work over the ethnic neighborhoods. He said, Attaway describes the newfound feeling of power, quote, always within him. He's talking about the hero, one of his 3 men that he writes about, who big, strong man who goes into the steel mills. And always within him was that instinctive knowledge that he was being turned to white men's uses. So also was with him a basic distrust of the white. But now he was the boss. He was the law. After all, what did right or wrong matter in the case? Those thrilling new words were too much to resist. He was a boss over whites. And what made the blacks so attractive from the Republican establishment is that the blacks in the South had long been oppressed by the Democratic Party, and when they came north, they were looking for Lincoln, and they voted overwhelmingly Republican for a decade until they found Franklin Roosevelt, and began to make the shift. By 1932, in this region, the blacks had moved about 40% into the Democratic column, and by 36, they were almost to 90% in the Democratic shift that Franklin Roosevelt and the CIO and the New Deal brought on. So the last thing I wanted to say is that trying to keep, there's so little written really during the strike about the role of the blacks, but I think in a way, one of my favorite quotes of all from August Wilson, from which Wally did a piece of this the other day. I saw it for the third time, how I learned what I learned. But August wrote a beautiful, powerful thing about the differential fate. Here was the blacks who came in and helped the corporate people triumph in the 1919 strike. But the white folks, Slavs, changing their names sometimes, or as the angel at St. Nicholas Church put their finger over over her mouth and tell them, don't speak, because your words betray you as a hunky, as a foreigner. Keep your mouth shut, work hard, work for your kids, and you'll get ahead, and they did. This is what August Wilson wrote. Near the turn of the century, the destitute of Europe sprang on the city with tenacious claws and an honest and solid dream. The city devoured them. They swelled its belly until it burst into 1,000 furnaces and sewing machines, 1,000 butcher shops and bakers' ovens, 1,000 churches and hospitals and funeral parlors and money lenders. The city grew. It nourished itself and offered each man a partnership limited only by his talents, his guile, and his willingness for hard work. For the immigrants of Europe, a dream dared and won true. The descendants of African slaves were offered no such welcome or participation. The city rejected them, and they fled and settled along the riverbanks and under bridges in shallow, ramshackle houses made of sticks and tar paper. They collected rags and wood. They sold the use of their muscles and their bodies. They cleaned houses, washed clothes, shined shoes. In quiet desperation and vengeful pride, they stole and lived in pursuit of their own dream, that they could breathe free finally and stand to meet life with the force of dignity and whatever eloquence the heart could call upon. And that culmination of their struggle, of course, is the civil rights movement of the 1960s and all the progress that we've really made ever since. And we face, brothers and sisters, obviously, a situation now that's almost too much like 1919, an empire, an American empire with soldiers in 100 places around the world, a military power that is in a very, very dangerous and volatile situation in this country. And we know we face incredibly difficult days ahead. 1919 is worth studying and thinking about. Thank you very much.